Good evening, everybody. Is this thing on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so a little introduction for myself. My name is Richard Craig, Associate Professor over in the Communications Department, Director of the MA program, and so it was an extreme honor and pleasure to be invited to facilitate or moderate this conversation this evening with Kim after watching Dark Money. And I have to tell you, I've watched this film in its entirety, and it's including like probably the fourth time, chopping it up, stopping and pausing it probably 15 or 20 times. And every time I watch it, I pick up on something new. And so with that, I really hope that there's a lot of questions from the audience, because there's so many ways you can geek out on this film, whether it be coming from the production attributes or the communication with the First Amendment and free speech attributes, journalism. So I'm hoping we get a lot of interaction with you all out there in the audience. So, but to start off, I just had two fundamental questions to start. First, talk to us about the timeline of putting something like this together. I know you give us the years, you know, in a chronological order in the midst of the production. But as I'm watching, one of the things that jumped out to me was John Adams. And he goes from being like this clean-shaven guy to at one point he's got like this full handlebar mustache. It's like one of those comedy movies where the character keeps coming back with a full beard at one point. But for me, it stuck out just in terms of like a lot of time went into this. And then you really start to see it as you jump around, and he has a broken hand at one point or a finger. So talk to us about when you make decisions about when to go and who to interview and talk to, things of that nature.
Yeah, thanks for coming, y'all. It's really nice to be here at GMU. So the film took 6 years to make. I did not realize it was going to take that long. I thought originally it would be a much quicker trip through the story. There was the film started in 2012 when Montana had the case that was defending the Corrupt Practices Act of 1912. Sorry, I'm vibrating here. Put this down. So that's what kind of kicked it off. That's what made me realize that we could tell the story about campaign finance by seeing it through the lens of what was going on in Montana and using that as kind of this microcosm like I was talking about earlier. We finished the film just in the nick of time to send it off to Sundance in 2017 and premiered in January. So it was almost exactly 6 years. And yeah, during the course of that time, there were a lot of different, ebbs and flows. One of the first things I realized was that you can't sort of parachute into this story and talk about money and politics, which is usually how people cover it, It's like, we talk about this race and it's mayhem and everybody's scrambling and nobody can keep track of where all the money is coming from and all the attacks. And then you kind of end up with whatever the results are of that election, and people kind of catch their breath for 2 years. And then the next election cycle comes around and everybody freaks out again, and it's like money is flying around, nobody tells where it's coming from. And kind of seeing that coverage of the political horse race every time it comes around convinced me that we needed to take a step back and to look at kind of 30,000-foot view of how these groups strategize around these elections, and especially because these dark money groups, they sort of pop up and they wreak havoc and then they disappear. But then the same group of people will reconstitute with a slightly different name or a really different name and spend money in the next election cycle and then shift again. So in order to really track these groups, we had to take a step back and follow it over multiple election cycles. So that was kind of the strategy behind that. And when you do that, unfortunately, sometimes your main characters change their facial hair quite. We had a test screening when we were getting ready to submit to Sundance, or maybe after we got in or something. And I did this thing that a lot of filmmakers do, where you pass out notes or you ask questions of people in the audience. And we had these little questionnaires, and they filled them out. And a couple of people came back saying, "We really like all the journalists that you have. Both of those journalists, the guy with the beard and the guy without the beard, it's like they work together really well." But then we realized that, well, a couple of things. The first thing we did is, like, every time you see him, there's a lower third that says John S. Adams, investigative reporter. So people kind of recognize him a little bit better, and that helped a little bit. But I had this breakthrough in the editing room, that if, like, everybody recognizes the dog. So if you cut to the dog first, and then you cut to John, John becomes the guy with the dog, not the guy with the differing facial hair. Yeah, and then just to mess things up, to try to mess me up totally, during the trial, when you had the broken hand, it was a skiing accident. There were a couple things going on. One was he was changing he got his hair cut and he shaved, so that screwed up the facial hair continuity. And then he was also in the process of going through physical therapy for his thumb. So he had every day his hair or facial hair or thumb cast situation was really different. So he was just trying to mess with me at that point. That's what's going on.
It was interesting. I think it was the former chair contextualized and framed the Watergate incident as a campaign, and most of us don't look at it in that way. So I thought it was very powerful for her to do that for us in that regard. So when you mentioned that, and then the other question before we come to the audience is the idea. You mentioned it a little bit, but why Montana? Because it seemed like there were a number of states and various political actors that you could have zeroed in on. You even mentioned Wisconsin at one point in the body of the film. Why Montana for you in terms of telling the story?
Yeah, one is that, you know, I looked into it in my research. I realized that it was just a really, really good case study. But it was also a case study that I knew I could tell, and that is because I'm from Montana and I grew up there. And I think that had I not grown up in Montana and had I not gone to grade school and heard these history stories about the Copper Kings and heard these stories about the influence of money in politics, without having driven past the Berkeley pit and heard those stories about these snow geese dying and literally seen the direct impact of bad decisions that were made a century ago. If I didn't have all that background, I don't think I would have been able to forecast that this would be the best case study and continue to be so, maybe even 6 years into the future. But I think sort of knowing the lay of the land a little bit and knowing how Montanans would react, and then supplementing that with some research into the situation, I realized that the same group of lawyers who were behind Citizens United were also opening law offices in Montana so they could continue. There's actually still some court cases that are working their way through the Montana Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit Supreme Court. You might see another one in the US Supreme Court soon. You could just see that this is going to be a flashpoint, and knowing Montanans and how they could, would respond, I think was a crucial part of that forecasting. And also, it's like these are my people. Like my dad grew up on a farm that was pretty close to John Tester's farm, that first scene where the guy's swearing at his farm equipment. And it's just like the guy reminds me a lot of my uncle. Like I know how to talk to these people. I live in New York, and I know lots of documentary filmmakers in New York who I love, but I don't know that they would have been able to parachute in and have the same access and talk to these people and meet them on their own ground and tell that story in the same way.
Awesome. Let's open it up to the audience. Any questions? Gentleman back here.
I'm Nick. I'm a film and video studies major here. This is kind of a more technical question. For your editing process, did you have a certain idea of what you wanted the film to look like, or was there a certain presentation you had in mind when you went into making this, or did it change over the course of editing the film and when you were working together with your editor?
So there's a couple different phases that I'll talk about, and then the technical issue, which is one is that when you shoot a film over 6 years, the camera technology shifts really rapidly, and you're upgrading constantly. You end up shooting on multiple cameras with multiple formats, and that's certainly something that happened with us. And then you just kind of do your best to, fix it in post, which you should never think about. You should never say, but sometimes you got to, and that's what we did. Sticking with the same lenses, even though you're using different cameras, can really help with that. overall, stylistically, I knew, like, I'm from Montana and it's beautiful and I love it and I wanted to show that. I wanted for people to love that place too. I wanted people to feel it in your gut when these snow geese die. And part of that is just feeling like you've seen this place and you are kind of sitting there and are experiencing the world from the same place. So you do that visually. So yeah, stylistically, I knew that Montana was going to have these big, huge vistas and tried to make it as beautiful as possible. It also turns out that a really good way to absorb the arcana of campaign finance regulations is to give people really pretty scenery to look at. You let it soak in a little bit. There's another stylistic thing, which is, I was in a class today and we were kind of talking about like retacking and kind of just going with the flow and just responding to the situations that are thrown at you. And one of those situations that was thrown at me was the fact that whenever I came to Washington, D.C. to shoot B-roll, to shoot the kind of covering footage that you use to stitch everything together, every time I came to D.C., the stuff I wanted to shoot was under construction. There were scaffolds up in front. And remember when the big scaffold was over the Capitol building like 2, 3, 4 years ago? That was there, and then went to the Supreme Court, and there was scaffolding all over there. And about the third shot in, I was just like, I'm going with this. Because this is a metaphor that we need to own. This is democracy under construction. It never is as it appears. You know, if you look under the hood, there's all this work that needs to be done. I don't, know if that comes through. I don't expect it to come through in such a literal fashion. That's how visual metaphors operate in this kind of subtle way. But that was the visual metaphor that we decided to go with. And so everything after that, I was looking for the construction that was happening. And it's almost always there. So, yeah.
Young lady back here, and this gentleman's hand went up, and I see 2 more hands coming up.
I don't think we watched Prodigal Sons for our documentary class in the FAMS program, English program. And coming off of watching that film and then coming in and watching this one, I just guess I'm very much interested in what made you go from such a personal and family scope to looking at, politics and American finance at large. It was just very interesting seeing the switch and what made you make that decision as a filmmaker.
Yeah, they're pretty different, aren't they? Like really kind of radically different in a lot of ways. But there's some common threads there too. One is that, this is kind of my backyard, right? This is where I'm from, and I think that an affection for the place and the people that are in that place, even though I think a lot of people, especially on the coast, may misunderstand all that stuff in the middle of the country, and I think that my sort of intent to show who these people are is something that really drives both of those films. I think that there's also something, like if you just look at what really motivates me as a filmmaker, this idea of justice and injustice and exposing injustice where I see it is something that's really important to me, and that's something that comes through, I hope, in Prodigal Sons, when you see, my brother with his head injuries kind of being misunderstood by the world, or me being trans being misunderstood by the world, and kind of our relationship, which is at the heart of Prodigal Sons being an important part of that equation too. And then there's another similarity that I ended up talking about too that is a little hard to describe, but I think that it's important. I don't know how the educators in the audience are going to feel about this, but it's important to have too big of a film to fit into a film. And I think that's something you could probably say about both of those. I like big, huge, messy stories where there's too much going on to fit into a film. And the process of distilling that is super important, and it gives you really, potentially really it gives you potentially really confusing stories. But if you can get it right, it gives you really potent stories. And as a viewer, as somebody listening to that story, I think it's important to feel like there's just a lot more going on out there that you need to kind of step up and get involved in. And it's also just interesting, and you know, sometimes you gotta watch it 4 times. But
well, it's interesting that you say that, because I was watching that film, I just kept thinking there's a lot to unpackage in this film. There's a lot to sift through and work through and understand. So it's amazing that you get it all in there in a way that you tell the story linear in a way for us to make sense of it.
Yeah, and that's the real challenge. And that process of condensing it, I think is I don't know. It's just something. It's a thing that I find. It's a puzzle that I find really, really intriguing about filmmaking and about storytelling in general. I've been working in opera too, and it's the same thing. You take a big, huge story and kind of just packing it down into this really, really potent story form. And I don't know. I appreciate poetry because of the compression that it's forced to undergo. And I'm not a poet, but I think that process of compressing these massive stories into these really tightly wound narratives is a challenge I really appreciate.
Some would argue that metaphorically filmmaking is poetry, and you're a very good poet by this standard. This young man over here had a question.
Yes. You mentioned earlier that it took you 6 years to make this film. I wanted to know how much of that was spent editing, what the editing process was like, and if there was something in particular that you guys shot that you were really proud of and ended up having to cut it out of the film.
Yeah, so I shot for about 5 years. Oh, and this kind of goes back to the previous question about those 2 different phases. I didn't get to the second phase. But shot for 5 years and then cut for about a year. Actually, it ended up being, well, it ended up being kind of 8 months of kind of principal editing and then some scrambling after that to prepare for the festival, but roughly a year. And during that year, there was another pass, and this goes to kind of the visual look and feel of the film. I had been filming a lot of the time-lapse stuff, a lot of the just scenic photography. There's a lot of shots of the Capitol building from a kind of the same perspective that I knew I would want to show this passage of time, passage of seasons, this time-lapse stuff where the fog is rolling in and out and revealing that Capitol dome, things like that. But then once we got in kind of deep into the heart of editing, it through conversations with my editor, who's Jay Sternberg, who's a great editor, we figured that it'd be really nice to have some aerial photography that would help us stitch a lot of this stuff together. And we also, at that point, had really decided to make the Berkeley Pit a main character for this and have this kind of bracketing device with the snow geese. I see somebody who happens to be from Montana, right? You heard the stories about the snow geese growing up, right? Everybody knows the story about the snow geese. She's sitting right in front of me. And so we went back for a trip during editing to get a lot of that kind of stitching material, kind of similar aerial photography that was of the same nature that would help us kind of cinch everything together so a lot of the visual styling that happened right at the end was done with that in mind. So one thing, really quickly, hit the editing room floor. There was a whole other, I'll tell you this one. So we had like a 10-minute chapter about Don McGann, who was very instrumental in kind of, I'll just quote Anne Rappel, who said that he was principally responsible for the decimation of the FEC and its ability to function in a fair way. And that was pretty interesting about his history of the FEC, especially if you consider his role in the current administration. But without being able to forecast what was going to happen with the current administration, it would just hit the cutting room floor.
A few hands popped up, and I think the last one was this young man here, and then this young man over to the far side in the white t-shirt.
Hello. My question is, throughout all the interviews that you've had in the movies, do you think that there were interviews that you could have had, but because of the way that the movie was, the scope of the movie was tilted, that you couldn't have those interviews? Like someone like Wittich, for example. Am I getting his name right?
Wittick.
Wittich,
Yeah.
sorry. Did you try to have interviews with those people, but they absolutely refused, or what, was there any kind of like negative feedback towards the movie?
I was sitting in Art Wittick's conference room with a camera set up and the lights set up, and I was ready to go, and he had agreed to the interview, but he came up with a contract that was not signable, and I didn't sign it, and we didn't get that interview. We were extremely close. I wish that we could have done it without the constraints that he was putting on it with that contract. But that's really the only interview that I wanted to get but was unable to get. There were actually a lot of I think probably what you're thinking of with interviews like that was some of the other players in the state that were involved in dark money or kind of defending the use of those 501c4 groups. Those were some other of those dark money stories that hit the cutting room floor. There's actually a state senator who was running a dark money group while he was in the state senate, and he was in Senate leadership. So imagine, like, if you don't vote the way I'm telling you, imagine if Mitch McConnell or Nancy Pelosi had a dark money group and she would threaten her own members, his own members, saying, if you don't vote the way that I want you to vote on this bill, and like you're gonna have postcards launched at you, and I'm gonna do it. So we had interviews with some folks like that were involved in that game. But yeah, this story required a lot of focusing in on that microcosm again, so that we could really show how all these dots are connected. So a lot of those stories hit the cutting room floor. But that's really the only one I wish we could have got. But I don't. At the end of the day, I don't know. It would have been hard to fold that in. It would have been tough to deal with, and I'm kind of glad that we saw Mr. Wittick when he was presented as a public official, sworn to tell the we had him there and we got the story that way.
As you tell the story, kind of as I listened to, you had a lot of Republicans in it that had been targeted by the dark money groups.
Majority.
Yeah, exactly. And it just kind of put me in mind of the argument against fantasy football, where people are like, it's ruining football, and people are selecting their favorite players and not supporting their team. And it kind of put me in that mind where evidently dark money is supporting their favorite players, the people they want, but not necessarily the team, regardless of how well the team is doing or not doing.
Yeah, it is kind of like that, and the impact that has on the political parties and the way that it has polarized them, I think is something we really need to look at, because there's a lot of polarization
All right, my turn, huh?
over there. Radio Rahim.
Well, obviously, I think when people watch this film, I think people get a sense of I think people that don't really know anything about this topic kind of get almost shocked, that this type of stuff goes on. During your research, during your journalism of covering this movie and making this film happen, what were some things, I guess, that stuck out to you as oh my God, I can't believe this going on? Some of the things that kind of really kind of shocked your world too, and that you can't believe this happened. And I have a second part of the question, but yeah.
The big thing, which is we kind of, if you look at the narrative structure of it, the kind of scariest part of the film is this, which it had a big impact on me. The impact of dark money on judicial elections or judicial nomination battles like we just saw at a very high level at the US Supreme Court. It's one thing to have this money operating in candidate elections. It's another thing even in policy debates, like with Medicaid expansion, you saw that, you know, dark money operating in Medicaid expansion in that town hall meeting in Montana. But when you consider the impact it has in selecting judges, how do I get a judge to recuse themselves from a case where they're ruling on people who have given them a lot of money? Like, as a member of the public, you're just totally in the dark about that, and you can never hold them accountable. And that's why the example of what happened in Wisconsin, I think, is particularly bracing, because these judges who were on the Supreme Court in Wisconsin shut down investigations into dark money groups that were giving money to them. So that's how a state like Wisconsin shifts so quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, the second question I have actually is not an extension of that question, but more just for the film as a whole. Again, you have some beautiful cinematography in the film, and I mean, a lot of it is the handheld cameras, a lot of it is the interview stuff, but I mean, the landscapes were amazing. So, like, how did you got some shots that looked like you were flying in the air, like your vision as well, like you were like you had the monument, you had like over the rivers and stuff. How were you able to like get shots like that high up?
You talking about the Washington Monument?
The Washington Monument, or even just like in Montana, you were like it just seemed like you were panning over buildings and stuff.
Yeah, I mean the aerial, we had a drone, and we were flying the drone all over, and it was like a pretty high resolution, 2.7K, almost 4K. And it was a great drone cinematographer that was there shooting it with prime lenses. So yeah, it's a good camera, and talented folks that I was lucky enough to be able to hire.
This young lady's hand went up next, and then this gentleman here kind of overlooked, right here in the sweater, in the middle of the. Oh, he had the question? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I thought your hand went up.
Yeah. Yeah, so I remember reading Jane Mayer's book on dark money. I think at the end she said she had like private investigators say Conor, by some co-brother group. I'm wondering if you had any similar kind of intimidation tactics by the swamp while filming this.
I'm doing all right. Okay, still not going to be on the road. Yeah, the film keeps kind of getting higher and higher in profile, which is actually really good defense against that because you're sort of already out. And I think that the good news with us, I've actually had the pleasure, the honor of meeting Jane Mayer and discussing this. They knew she was working on that book and investigating and digging and asking questions of all these people. So they got wind of that and I think started trying to shut that down in a way that I was not susceptible to it. So doing okay so far, but I changed all my passwords.
This young man.
So you spoke to using visual metaphors through the scaffolding in the building and in DC, and also using the geese as a framing device in the film itself. And I feel like the geese lake situation can also be used as a metaphorical situation, at least in personal interpretation. So my question is, as a documentary filmmaker, how do you navigate using visual metaphors and using metaphors as a concept itself with the literal filmmaking requirements the documentary filmmaking has? How do you navigate that gray area between objective fact and subjective interpretation?
Vis-a-vis using a metaphor? I just think that I never rely on the metaphor alone. It's very important that there were 300 geese and they died, and then there were 3,000 geese and they died. And just that story alone, I think really gets the point across. But I think you also have to just understand that there's gonna be metaphorical implications of this, and if nobody had ever seen the Berkeley Pit or understood or just walked in just for that one scene, you're gonna understand that the implications of, you know, this historical decision. So it's not about sort of using one to substitute for the other. I mean, you kind of always got to assume that that fact is going to make its way through, that people are going to understand the story, that, you know, decisions made a century ago led to 300 and then 3,000 geese being killed. But I think, as opposed to just people understanding the story, if you want them to remember the story, if you really want it to hit them on an emotional level, using metaphor is a really powerful way. A lot of times I don't like talking about metaphor that much because I don't want poetry or the film to become this kind of secret decoding exercise of what did the filmmaker really mean. I think a lot of times it's a lot simpler than that. It's like the birds died. If we use that again and bracket the film with that, and you know that as a filmmaker, I'm kind of shoving this in your face again and saying, yo, this is important, pay attention to this. You're just gonna feel that coming through in a formalistic way. Like you're gonna tell that I'm falling back on this framing device, that I'm calling to your attention as viewers. I'm saying, look at this repetition of form. This is important. And as such, hopefully that's just gonna, it's gonna let those metaphors, those visual metaphors, sit with you in a way that they resonate emotionally, hopefully without, pointing at it too starkly, too strongly.
This young lady and then the young lady in the black shirt.
Hi, I'm also interested in the impact of the film. I know you said you're doing well, but I'm wondering, I'm wondering what kind of pushback have you seen? And because film has such power to change minds and build awareness, maybe a hopeful point about ways that you've seen influence in terms of people maybe knowing more now than they knew before, and maybe doing things now that they weren't doing before. If you could leave us with that at least.
Yeah. My favorite response, which we got a lot, is like, it just makes me want to go vote. It makes me want to get engaged. It makes me want to go. I just feel like I need to go volunteer, do something. And I really like the fact that I hear that from both sides of the aisle. The story that took place in Montana happened with one political party attacking itself. And so, and if you look at the polls of what the American public abroad thinks about the issue of money in politics, it's very much a bipartisan issue. Like it's a problem everywhere you look. So the fact that this can just kind of push people into engagement, I think is the most important thing. That's a good message right here, rolling into election day, right? So make sure you vote. So yeah, and the reception that we've seen so far has been the good news is that no matter where we take it, people are applying it to their own situation, kind of like I said in the intro. The bad news is no matter where we take it, people have something to apply it to. Like this sort of dark money spending is happening all the time. And it's great when I feel like we've made this tool that we can hand over to people so that they can go to their city council or school board or state legislature and say, look, like this is going on here. And we've seen that happen with some folks who are kind of in the thick of things, like the Arizona legislature, the New Mexico legislature, they use this as a kind of look, see, this is what happened there. So hopefully that I want you guys to to walk out of here with some hope that you can change things. It may bum you out that a lot of dark money is being spent at the lowest levels, really, of political engagement. I'm talking school boards, I'm talking city councils. But it should also give you a lot of faith that you can have a big impact by getting involved at those same levels. There's about 500, 750 cities across the US who have issued resolutions stating that they want to repeal the tenets of Citizens United, that we're not going to run our own elections according to these faulty rules. So that's, I think, the way this is going to spread from the bottom up, from the grassroots up.
We'll take one more from this side, so I don't have to send our microphone person over there.
406, 406.
Yeah, this is like old homecoming for me, so thank you. I just really enjoyed it personally, but also professionally, because as you know, George Mason University is really ground zero for Koch University, right? For the Koch's major influence on public higher education and really manipulating our university through their donor giving. So my question is, will you do a film here help us and document what's going on in public higher education? Because it's not just buying politics, they're buying us too.
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem. It's a huge influence. Maybe I'll have to get together with Jane Mayer and we'll come down and do both. Although I think the fundamental issues are really the same. That if you're going to try to hide money, hide influence in these really important governmental institutions like our elections, like our public universities, it just isn't fair. It undercuts the tenets of our democratic small d society, and it's just not fair. I showed up to do a live podcast interview, and there was kind of a mix-up, and the wrong audience was there for this live podcast that I was doing. And it ended up being the Boys and Girls Club of San Leandro, California, ranging from 6 years old to I think about 14 years old. And at first I was like, God, I've got to talk about campaign finance. I haven't even seen the movie. How are we going to possibly have this discussion? But they get it when you talk about this fundamental sense of fairness, that here's the rules, these people are playing by it, those people aren't, that ain't fair. It's just like, it's recess rules is really what's going on. And they understood it. That's exactly the same thing that really deeply offended a lot of these Republican elected officials who were attacked by their own party. And you were there. I mean, you saw some of this stuff happening. That's really where it all started. And if it weren't for those people who really stood up and cried foul against the wishes of their own party, if it weren't for heroes like that, if it weren't for these dogged heroes working in state offices in the little blue house with the railing falling off the wall, for kind of everyday heroes like that, we wouldn't be where we are. If it weren't for whistleblowers like Sarah Arnold in the trial at the end, we wouldn't be where we are. And last but certainly not least, if it weren't for investigative reporters who are really on the trail and following this and reporting on it, and the Fourth Estate, I saw that your school newspaper was called the Fourth Estate. That's a great name. If it weren't for the whole Fourth Estate holding everybody else accountable, that's really what we need. And it's that sense of fairness that I think needs to drive everything.
As we allow the microphone to travel to the other side of the room, I just want to chime in as I watch your documentary and your piece. Something that also jumps to my mind, and they mentioned the idea of the founders of the nation, and we have this idea of separation of church and state, but the founders never thought about separation of corporations and state, just in regards to those ties.
Yeah, corporations weren't even really much of an idea. Certainly not. I mean, corporations were originally designed to, if we're going to build a bridge, we would form a corporation and build a bridge, and then once the bridge is done, you dissolve it. And this idea of a perpetual, ongoing, entity that just gets bigger and bigger and greedier was not what they had in mind. And certainly the idea of multinational corporations that are spanning the borders of countries is this is not what they were planning on. And I venture to say that they were not planning on those corporations having free speech rights either.
Hello.
Hey.
Okay. I was interested in knowing how you got into this, sphere of this topic. And as an audience member, I found it very easy actually to follow along and understand what concept you're talking about. So I was just interested in that, and as well as how to coordinate all of those interviews. That must have been a hassle to do. So I was just really interested in that, as well as how you got into this topic as well.
Kind of the sense of fairness. Just as when I heard about the Citizens United decision, it just seemed like a really terrible idea about how to run a democracy. And it's people are only going to start listening to a handful of people who are billionaires, and they're going to ignore everybody else. And at first I didn't know what to do about that, but luckily I found a foothold in telling the story through these individuals, these everyday heroes that we found in Montana. Piecing the whole story together, that's the hard part. That's why you spend a year editing the piece. I would just say you just have to be really ruthless with the logical flow from one person's phrase to the other person's phrase. And if there's if it's janky at all, it's gonna throw people off, and they're gonna fall. They're gonna just kind of lose track of the film. They're gonna become disengaged. And I worked again with a really great editor who was really ruthless about that logic and about getting us just one step down the road. And then once you do that, you take a step back and you make sure that you're doing, and this is the hard part, all that other stuff that you gotta do, which is tell a story over time and this chronology. And while you're doing so, kind of introducing all these campaign finance issues that people gotta understand, so that when we tell this mystery story at the end in the trial, that this is gonna make sense, So it's kind of like an episode of Law and Order, but you gotta understand all this campaign finance rules early on, right? In the first part of the episode before you go to the courtroom. And then there was another kind of ping-ponging back and forth between showing stuff in Montana where it's working and they're making headway and there's progress, versus what's going on in DC, where it's just breaking down. So that sort of contrast was another. And then, just mix all that together. We actually, I was talking about this earlier today, we had a very complicated Google spreadsheet that was kind of tracking all of these different concepts and scenes and where they were going and what they were doing and how we're telling this historical story and how that's going to fit in and work with the present day story and how we're going to bounce back and forth to DC. It gets complicated, but that's why you just find really smart people to work with, and that's why you keep showing it to test audiences, and they can tell you that your two journalists are working really well together.
Let's see. This young man's hand went up, and then this young person back here.
It seems like there was a lot of investment and engagement from the residents of Montana on this issue. I was just curious what their temperament was, or what the climate of the residents were after the trial ended and the punishment for Whittick was $68,000 and he wasn't even removed from office. Were they happy with just a W, or was there any sort of blowback?
People were really engaged. That trial was like front page of all the newspapers above the fold sort of thing for all week long. Everybody was really following it. Believe it or not, that's a lot of money there. If you're talking about a state where the typical campaign for office costs about 10, 15, 20 grand to run for office, for him to have that penalty was substantial. It actually increased to about 100 grand ultimately. And I think that the question was kind of moot about whether he should be removed from office. It was a little bit technical. When all of these violations occurred, he was in the Senate. And then when things started looking a little shady, even though he was not termed out in the Senate, he ran for a seat in the House. And so when he was found guilty and was supposed to be, the question was whether he should be removed from his office, their argument was, well, my office is for me to be in the House. And that stuff happened when I was in the Senate. So if you're gonna remove me from my seat, you have to remove me from the Senate, but I'm not there, so it mooted out kind of the whole question about whether he should be removed from office. But the real comeuppance was that he lost in the primary election, which is where all this stuff first happened. He was voted out of office. So yeah, just in general, what I would say is that what happened, I think is really interesting, especially if you consider the current election as it's going on right now. The political culture there changed, and people had been paying a lot of attention because of this history and because of the skepticism about money in politics that happens in Montana, that people did have their eyes pretty wide open. But what really happened, especially because of the attention of this trial, is people got really sensitized to it. And these days, not only did they pass really strong legislation to prevent elections like that from happening again, it also really forced people to pay more attention to it. So now that anybody who runs for office has got to have a position on these dark money groups, is reluctant to take any dark money, and is probably accusing their opponent of taking dark money, because it's really something that people run on. It's part of the conversation, and it has to do with this people raising their media literacy so that they really pay attention to this. And I think that that's a really good example for the rest of the states to follow, for the country to follow, is to get that engaged and to have that media literacy. An interesting contrast to that is going on right now, like today in Montana, because John Tester is running for Senate. There's tons of money being spent in Montana, right? Because that's controlled by the FEC. That's a federal election that's taking place under federal laws, not Montana state laws. If it was taking place under Montana state laws, there'd be a lot less dark money being spent, but that's not the case. So that contrast of, and kind of schizophrenia, where the state and local elections are running pretty clean, but the federal elections are just a mess, is again a pretty stark example.
Just quickly to follow up on your comment in regards to the media literacy component, one of the things that's caught and packaged in this movie is the idea of the connection to media, and the reporting that is lacking in regards to covering this. And you see it with John Adams, your two reporters, just in regards to not only losing his job, but then trying to figure out different ways. And I love one of the final scenes with the reporter that's doing his own camera work, catching it, and so you're demonstrating the difficulty that exists for those that are in this profession because of corporate interests in regards to journalism, and then also the connection it has to covering politics.
Yeah, we were talking a little earlier today in a classroom about being a documentary filmmaker, and when sometimes something bad happens to a person, and it's good for the film. And when John lost, this is what I was talking about earlier, when John lost his job, I was like, man, that's terrible, but you know what? He is emblematic of what's going on in the rest of the country, and he's fighting the same fight that a lot of other journalists are having to fight. So to watch him claw his way back and live out of his truck and try to scrape together his thing. By the way, he's doing good. He does no longer lives in his truck. He just hired he told me today on the phone that he just hired his first employee. So he's expanding, and his nonprofit is doing really well. Yeah, it was also like not just not just about telling this other story about John in his life as a reporter, you also have this interweaving of these two storylines that for me I really liked because it was so organic, that you know, it just, I think, makes people feel, and this is what we were trying to do in the editing room, is if you show these reporters following money and politics and revealing all of these mysteries, and then you pull that reporter out of the equation, you feel it in your gut that this is what we really need to have in order to hold these people accountable, in order to tell truth to power, and in order to have a fourth estate who's going to keep things, you know, out in the open, and keep everything transparent, so that you don't end up with the three branches of government like you did in Wisconsin, none of whom are holding each other accountable, and then the press falls apart too. So yeah, we really wanted to call attention to just how crucial it is to have reporters like that are following the story.
To our audience.
That you covered most of my question. I was going to ask, or say it was so helpful to have him as a character to kind of guide us through the complexity of the campaign finance law.
That's how he started. That's all I wanted him to do, is like, you're our narrator, just carry us through the story, and then he got fired.
Well, and then I just wondered how early in your process you connected with him as major character in the story.
Yeah, I met him about a year into filming, and at that point, after having followed his reporting, I tried to convince him to be our lens, be our, you know, guide. He was a reporter. He was reluctant to go on camera. He didn't want to be part of the story. But it took me about another year after that, and then about 2 years into the project, he went on camera.
Other questions from our audience? Oh, this young man over here has a question.
I'm gonna move back so I don't mess with mine.
So you mentioned like the concepts of justice and going against injustice in your filmmaking, and with this, I got very much like a sense of unity, and you talked on it before, but since I only have a very minor understanding of Montana state politics now, has this always been an issue that both parties were so like staunchly unified from the perspective of? Because like for me, it's very rare to see Democrats and Republicans like agree on something, let alone be so vocal about this. So did you go into this knowing that this would be something that could potentially be unifying, knowing that both sides are very staunchly opposed to this, or is that something you found out like while you were in the process of recording and then realized like, oh, this could be the focal point or message of it?
Yeah. So I went into it knowing that there was a lot of kind of broad-based support to reform campaign finance laws, that a lot of people agreed on this on both sides of the aisle. I also knew that this was an interesting constellation of events, because we had Republicans who were attacking Republicans, and that was an interesting story for me to tell, because I could tell it in a way without having to break down along partisan lines immediately. And that's really important, because when you're telling a story about a bipartisan issue, you can't, you know, put this film out there and have it break down onto partisan lines immediately. It still happens a little bit. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like that's not there at all, but it happens a lot less. I mean, as you were saying, the majority of the characters in our film are Republicans, and they're talking about being attacked by other Republicans. So you can't turn it into this tit for tat thing. I do not think I would have been nearly as interested in this project if it had been, you know, this partisan thing. But to be able to just talk about the issue without having it break down, that was a big, interesting part of the story. I had no idea that we would be where we are now. where stuff is really hyper partisan, where stuff is, there's very few issues where there's any sort of unity or any sort of agreement across the aisles. But that was important to me then when I started and decided to continue with the project year after year. And I think it's more important than ever to find those rare areas where there is bipartisan agreement so we can move some issues forward. And hopefully this is going to be one of them.
Other questions?
Hello. So I was just wondering about your editing process and how did you ever have to do reshoots? Because I always wonder that with documentary filmmaking.
There were no reshoots, but that process of going back to Montana and shooting that aerial photography that was B-roll, you know, it was additional photography. There were no characters that were involved in that. It was just like aerial photography and this shot and that shot. Is that true? Yeah. Yeah. We shot stuff inside the Capitol. We went, we did shoot one kind of, yeah, we shot one scene that hit the cutting room floor, but that had John Adams in it. But that was about it. It was just to provide that, you know, that kind of through line.
The U.S. Capitol.
What's that?
The Montana Capitol or the U.S. Capitol?
Montana Capitol. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things I follow up with is I was curious, how did you select some of the landscape scenes that you're doing? Because they're beautiful and just magnificent. You get the idea where you're in the truck riding along with some of you have the cameras with those individuals, you're catching scenes, but the purposeful selection of some of the landscape and the mountains that you had, was that your experience and knowledge of Montana, or how did you make those selections?
I think so. I think I'm just really sensitive to light, and you know, I always have a camera with me, and when something hits the right way, you know, yeah. And some of it was more just kind of pedestrian, like I need a shot in the summer when it's like this, and so I gotta, and you get the best one that you can, but sometimes it's just like, you know, something just hits you right.
Kind of those scout rules, always be prepared.
Yes, exactly.
I was curious, one of the things I wanted to compliment you on too, and talk to us about that approach of trying, because one of the students asked about that, trying to get as balanced a voice as you could from different perspectives, and you had the American Tradition Party, I think that's what they were called, at least a representative in there to speak for them, and then we come to realize they were also the Western Tradition Party. Talk to us about what that process is like in trying to encourage those, you know, voices that did not necessarily see the way you see things, to speak up and have a voice in the film.
Yeah, I think, you know, with any debate, with any documentary, that it's just incumbent upon you to cover both sides of the argument, to hear all sides of the issue. When I'm just considering something myself, I want to hear all of the sides. When I'm watching another film, if I am only hearing one side of the argument and not the counter argument, I start to get suspicious of the filmmaker. I want to hear the other side, and that's especially true as a documentary filmmaker who uses the First Amendment every day. I wanted to hear that First Amendment argument, that there's not enough speech, we should spend more money, we don't have enough of this. If you notice, there was a really concerted effort to avoid doing anything that would color or shift the way that we are going to perceive Jim Brown, who's the attorney for ATP. There's no music in that scene because I didn't want to push people toward interpreting him one way or another. And that's one of the few scenes where it's just like he's untouched by the music, because it just wanted to be this flat presence. Give him the stage here. And he gets pretty good stage there for a while. But yeah, you know, you always have to hear both sides of the story. I don't want to pretend like I'm just splitting it right down the middle. I certainly have opinions on it, but you always got to hear the counter argument, and I think that at the end of the day, it just makes your argument stronger.
And he commanded the stage, because I had to watch it the second time to realize like he was really doubting or questioning that whole car theft thing and the documents that were uncovered. And all. He's doubtful of this. He's questioning. He doesn't believe it.
Yeah.
So yeah, he definitely commanded in that way. Other questions or further questions from our audience?
I know you touched on this a little bit and touched on it a little bit in the film, but I did wonder what the overall impact of the 2016 election had on how you viewed this film, and if you had any ideas about going back and changing anything, talking any more about it, just kind of how that impacted the way you viewed the film, the way you looked at it out there.
Yeah, it made that, it made the way that we treated that Don McGann, like it was tough for people who were then involved in the administration, like after we had seen them in the FEC and they moved into this other position. I ultimately felt like we couldn't hold Don McGann responsible for what he accomplished at the FEC by predicting that he was going to behave the same way in the administration. Like you couldn't hold his feet we could hold his feet to the fire for what happened at the FEC, but we couldn't then say, and he's that same person who will always behave like that on into the future in the administration. And I think that does happen a lot in documentaries, frankly. So that was part of the reason why he didn't end up in there. So that was a big sort of shift that happened in the 2016 election. I don't know, what happened in 2016 was just kind of inverted a lot of the way that money usually operates in politics. It defied a lot of rules, and Trump defied a lot of rules. He broke a lot of rules. He's like upset the apple cart, and kind of the traditional modes of thinking just did not apply in that election because it was so upside down. That we're back to the same way that elections have operated ever since then. All the non-presidential elections in 2016 operated according to the way that money in politics always runs everything, and dark money kind of held sway. So I'm kind of, in retrospect, glad that we avoided like coming out in 2016, because it was just so, everybody was paying attention to the presidential elections and kind of losing what was kind of de rigueur for elections. And kind of, it was just a really bad example, because that one election that was upside down cast a long shadow on everything else. But yeah, it's just record-breaking money, record-breaking dark money. The loophole's bigger than ever. People are using it more than ever, and it's a bigger problem than ever.
Listening to you tonight, it puts a lot of things in perspective in terms of your film in regards to anybody watching, especially if you're not real familiar with dark money or the codes and things of that nature. This becomes a little overwhelming, depressing. It's kind of like, but when you listen to you talk, and the idea of start at the local level. We get so caught up at the national or the federal, we forget we can do a lot at that local level. Could you speak a little bit more to that? Because a lot of your politicians were state representatives that did a lot with their local constituents.
Yeah, that's right. And that's right. And you saw Americans for Prosperity holding town hall meetings to try to shift or affect or influence elected officials' votes on Medicaid extension. I mean, that's what that town hall meeting was about. There are plenty of stories about dark money operating in school board elections and city council or county commission, whatever you call it here, county commission elections. So, that's where I think people need to get involved. If that's where the problem is, that's where you go to fix the problem. In a lot of ways, what happens at the presidential elections, you don't see it as much, because there's so much attention, there's such a spotlight. And that's kind of like the cultural, political shift that we saw happen in Montana when people really started paying attention to it. is you just couldn't get away with spending the secret money anymore, because everybody was like, what's going on here? Sounds like maybe some of that happens here on campus, that, you know, if everybody is like, this is wrong, where did that money come from, we should know, you know, that's half the game right there.
And I'll say, I represented the faculty senate on a couple of occasions, and we've seen some of our students come in, they're transparent GMU, I think there are GMU, a couple of members here evidently.
Yeah.
And you know, that's a strong message for them to get active at that level, especially as students in an environment that directly impacts them. Who's educating them in the classroom hopefully is not influenced by the dark money.
Right, absolutely.
Other questions from the audience?
What's next?
Good question.
What's next? I'm talking to a couple of folks about like what the next project is going to be. It's nothing I can like get into now. I'll tell you that I'm interested in media consolidation and some of these stories about, you know, television stations getting bought up and consolidated. I think that, and then another project that we're kind of taking out into the world is all about disinformation. Misinformation is stuff that's just false or maybe a lie. Disinformation is intentionally false information that you're spreading around for propagandistic purposes. And there's a lot of that going around, and we're seeing it coming from internationally. We're seeing it, we're hearing it every day. And the way that our culture contends with that information flow and the way that it filters out disinformation, I think is going to be a huge challenge for our society coming up. We're bumping into it all over the place, and social media, Facebook and Twitter are huge parts of that. And it's a big problem that we've got to solve, so I'm very interested in that.
Two things that to follow up your statement. The one, people often ask me, because I teach in media and communication, I'm like, what do you think about this fake news? I'm like, well, that just depends. But if you're talking about Donald Trump, that's nothing new. It's really propaganda, just repackaging this idea of fake news, like you're saying. Maybe explore the idea of misinformation, disinformation, how it fits into, we appreciate the historical attributes of it. So I think for you to do a piece in that regard would be very powerful. And the media consolidation, you may not have noticed, but a big smile went across my face. Just in terms of, that's particularly one of my research areas, and talking with people about that all the time, and how we don't realize a lot of what we listen to and watch is greatly influenced by corporations that are controlling local levels of media. So I'd be interested to see what you do with that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And again, it's about that injustice. It's about, you know, not playing by those rules.
So with that, are there any closing thoughts that you really encourage your audiences to walk away with your film?
You know, just get engaged. And there are some things that are discouraging, but I don't want them to be bummed out. There's so many ways to plug in, and just no matter which side of the aisle you're on, whether you want to get plugged into some really local action, or whether it's more of a longer term, bigger horizon movement to repeal Citizens United through a constitutional amendment, which is a steep climb, but is a climb that we need to be on. And you know, find a way to get involved. We have a webpage, darkmoneyfilm.com. There's a page called Get Involved, and it just gives you all sorts of different organizations to plug into. So yeah, help us spread the word. And you know, I can actually tell you guys that we're gonna be streaming on Amazon Prime starting tomorrow. So Halloween is a good spooky day to roll out.
Dark money on Halloween. Well, Kim, we thank you so much for coming and spending time with us. And it's a great film.